The heat inside the kitchen behind Colonel Dandridge's mansion was not just from the firewood stacked beneath the black iron stove. It was from the weight of sweat and silence. Smoke clung to the ceiling beams like ghosts, curling around the rafters above the heads of the enslaved workers. The scent of garlic, onions, and cumin mingled with the meat stew bubbling in a dented cauldron. It was the smell of hunger for some, power for others. At the center of it all stood Josiah. Tall, wiry, with a back curved from years of bending over flames, Josiah stirred the heavy pot with a worn wooden spoon, its handle scorched black from too many nights forgotten over fire. The heat licked at his skin, but his face never flinched. He'd cooked through fevers, bruises, and heartbreak. His hands bore the marks of all three. Yet they moved with precision, folding spices into broth as if he were performing a sacred rite. He was the plantation's cook, and he knew it like a preacher knew his pulpit. Every morning before the roosters crowed, Josiah stepped into that kitchen, barefoot on cracked brick floors, to prepare meals he'd never taste. Fresh bread, smoked pork, candied yams, and spice-laced stews. He cooked for the colonel's guests, for the parties that rolled through Natchez like storm clouds. When it came time to feed his own family in the slave quarters, there were bones, roots, or nothing at all. The colonel had once told a neighbor, bourbon in hand and a sneer on his lip, "That boy Josiah seasons like he was born with salt in his soul. Pity he can't use it to buy his freedom." Then he had laughed like he'd told the finest joke south of the Mississippi. Colonel Ambrose Dandridge was a man of stature, at least in his own eyes. Tall, silver-haired, with a red face always damp from whiskey or rage, he walked the halls of his estate like a general inspecting troops. The walls of his parlor were lined with portraits of Confederate officers and taxidermy trophies. He called himself a gentleman of order, but his hands were never far from his riding crop. Discipline, he claimed, kept the dark folk in line. Discipline was how he'd taken Josiah's wife. Her name had been Rose, and she sang while she worked, soft songs in gullah tongue from her Carolina roots. She once stitched a piece of blue cloth into the inside of Josiah's shirt, whispering, "So you always got a sky on your heart." When their daughter fell sick and Josiah stole onions and lard from the main house to make a healing broth, the colonel found out. Said theft was theft, no matter the reason. Rose was sold within 3 days, no goodbyes, no chance to plead, gone like breath in winter. Josiah's daughter, Ruthie, followed months later. A fever took her, one even his best broth couldn't beat. He had cradled her cooling body in his arms as the sun rose beyond the cotton fields, painting the sky the same blue as that scrap Rose had sewn into his shirt. That was 4 years ago. Since then, Josiah had spoken less and listened more. Watched, waited. The other enslaved folks said he was still water, and they weren't wrong. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. But every movement he made was slow and sure, as though he were writing a recipe that no one else could read. That morning, as the colonel's hunting party prepared for a grand supper, Josiah stood over the stew again. Venison meat, carrots, parsnips. His fingers sprinkled thyme, sage, a bit of molasses for richness. He stirred clockwise, the wooden spoon sweeping through bubbling brown like a clock hand turning back time. Behind him, laughter rose from the parlor. The colonel bragged about the number of bales harvested, about a new mare from Virginia, about how his cook was so good he could trick the devil into licking his plate. Josiah stirred. The fire cracked like bones in the hearth. Sweat traced the ridge of his spine. He looked down at the stew, fragrant, rich, alive with warmth, and whispered, voice low as breath, "Every spice carries memory. One day it will carry something else." The pot hissed as he dropped in a final pinch of crushed red pepper. He didn't smile, but something flickered in his eyes, like a coal buried deep, finally catching flame. The plantation whispered when the white folk weren't listening. In the spaces between chores and the dark corners of sheds, in the hush of dawn and the creak of the sugar crates, The enslaved spoke in low tones, soft as dust and sharp as razors. "Did you hear what Enoch done over at Coldwater? They say he took a branding iron to the overseer's throat. Vanished after, like smoke, left only a boot behind." Josiah didn't talk much, but he listened. He always had. Behind the kitchen, under the stacked sacks of flour, sat an old wooden crate where he kept his real tools. Small glass jars with no labels, folded cloth bundles filled with dried leaves, and a rusted pestle that had once belonged to his grandmother, who'd been known as a root doctor back in Georgia before the chain gangs took her. Most on the plantation knew Josiah as the cook, a man with salt on his knuckles and grease on his apron. But there were some, old Lizzie who did the laundry, Elias the stable hand, and sweet Ada, who swept the dining room after every supper, who knew he was more than that. They had seen him pluck weeds from the riverbank and tuck them in his sleeve. They had watched him test the color of a boiled root like an alchemist, not a servant. "Your hands know more than flour and butter," Lizzie once told him, squinting at a paste he had made from poppy and ash. "You got healer fingers, or killer ones. Depends on which way you stir." It wasn't a joke. Nothing ever really was. One evening, a week before the colonel's banquet, Josiah was called to serve tea to a gathering of soldiers and neighbors. He stood near the back wall of the parlor while the men smoked cigars and roared with laughter. Colonel Dandridge, red-faced and soaked in bourbon, waved toward Josiah without turning. "This here's Josiah," he slurred. "Been in my kitchen since he had milk on his breath. Thinks he's some kind of chef. But he's just a kitchen boy, really. Ain't that right, son?" The guests chuckled. Josiah didn't move, didn't blink, just bowed his head and carried the tray away. That night, he sat alone on a wooden stool behind the smokehouse. The moonlight cut through the trees like silver blades. In his lap, he rolled a small brown seed between his fingers. It came from a plant called rosary pea, one he'd learned about from an old field worker who died 2 summers back. Just one crushed bead could stop a man's heart like a slammed door. He remembered Rose's last words the day she was led away in chains. "Don't let them break your mind, Joe. They can take your body, but not your thinking." She had kissed his palm and pressed the blue scrap of cloth into it. "Live long enough to remember who you are." He had tried. Lord knows he had tried. But remembering hadn't softened anything. It had sharpened it. Now each memory was a blade he honed in silence. Back in the kitchen, he began to work slower, but not out of fatigue. Every stir, every chop, became cover for experimentation. He boiled harmless herbs beside deadly ones, watching how long it took for bitterness to rise. He mixed yarrow with wild apple bark, grinding them into powder with the back of his spoon. He measured, weighed, adjusted, always pretending it was just about flavor. Elias once peeked in and saw Josiah placing a sprig of black nightshade into a jar beneath the spice rack. "You plannin' to season or slaughter?" Elias asked, half smiling, half afraid. Josiah looked up with calm eyes and said only, "Both." He kept a ledger in his mind, every cruelty, every laugh at another's suffering, every time the colonel had ordered someone whipped for dropping a plate or breathing too loud. They stacked inside him like logs on firewood, and now they were ready to burn. He tested a broth with a single red seed shaved into it, then dumped it out, not ready. Not yet. He soaked leaves in warm vinegar and timed the reaction. He watched how one made his fingers tingle, another made his tongue go numb. He learned. Every morning he served breakfast with the same steady hands. Every evening he bowed as the colonel passed by, but each day his secret stock grew stronger. Each night he sat behind the smokehouse whispering to the moon. "He thinks I only serve him food," he said one night, watching the flicker of a candle in the upstairs window. "But I will serve him justice." And the flame in Josiah's chest, once dim and flickering, now roared with quiet promise. Word spread faster than fire in Kane. Colonel Dandridge was hosting a supper. The reason, as always, was pride. He had just overseen the largest cotton yield in his plantation's history, and Natchez society needed to know. The colonel sent out invitations to every wealthy planter, land baron, and retired officer within 30 miles. His instructions were simple. There would be venison, duck, brandied pears, and barrels of imported wine. There would be music. There would be applause. And most importantly, there would be him, a living monument to Southern power and order. On the morning of the banquet, the Dandridge estate crackled with activity. Enslaved hands polished silver until their knuckles bled. They dusted the high mirrors, swept the stairs, laid out china with gold trim so fine it was only used once a year. The dining room glowed in candlelight and cypress wood, with a table long enough to seat 20 and wide enough to hold pride itself. Josiah, as always, said nothing, but his eyes moved. In the kitchen, he worked with a quiet that made the younger kitchen hands nervous. He organized every ingredient with surgical care: duck to roast, corn cakes to flip, okra to fry, figs to stuff with pecans and honey. The iron stove roared beneath his feet, and his white apron was already stained by mid-morning. He tied his kerchief tight. He ground dried thyme and sea salt in a bowl and set it aside. He sliced fresh sage leaves, let them soak in lemon juice and butter. He stewed rabbit meat until it fell apart beneath his spoon. And then came the colonel's favorite, a thick venison stew, dark and spiced, always served in a deep ceramic bowl and garnished with red pepper and parsley. The colonel swore by it. "Josiah's stew," he once told a traveling preacher, "is so fine it could raise the dead or kill 'em depending on how much he serves ya." The line had drawn laughter. Josiah had smiled. Quietly. Now he stood before the simmering pot once more. His spoon stirred the bubbling surface with the same practiced rhythm he'd used for years. Except this time, he didn't reach for the parsley. He reached beneath the wooden counter, behind a sack of flour, and pulled out a small glass jar. Inside it, powder the color of crushed bone and rust. Crushed rosary pea. Dried apple leaf. A pinch of aconite. He hesitated, just a breath. There were too many eyes, too many ears. What if a child ate it by mistake? What if someone else took the bowl, but he had been careful? This bowl would go directly to the colonel. Always had, always would. His hand didn't shake as he tapped the powder in. He stirred slowly, counterclockwise this time. A choice. A symbol. By the time the guests arrived, dressed in silks and powdered collars, the feast was nearly ready. Carriages lined the gravel road in front of the estate. Horses snorted in the fading light. White-gloved houseboys opened the doors while overseers barked orders in hushed tones. Laughter spilled from the entrance hall as the guests flowed inside like wine from an open cask. In the parlor, the colonel stood beneath a chandelier, puffed up like a rooster in parade colors. "Gentlemen," he bellowed, lifting a glass of bourbon, "tonight we celebrate prosperity, tradition, and the good order of the Southern way." Applause. Laughter. No one heard the soft creak of a kitchen door closing. Josiah moved through the hall with a tray in each hand, wine glasses, bread, honeyed figs. His eyes stayed low, but his ears caught every word. 300 bales this season," the colonel boasted. "Best harvest this side of the Mississippi." "You employ more help than some whole counties," another guest said. The colonel grinned. "I breed order, discipline. Without it, these people would run wild." The guests chuckled. Josiah kept walking. Back in the kitchen, he ladled the stew into the large ceramic bowl. A sprig of thyme floated on top like a wreath on water. He paused. Was this justice? Would it bring Rose back? Would Ruthie smile from the heavens? Maybe not, but it would end him. That would be enough. Josiah carried the bowl down the hall with steady arms, the aroma rich and intoxicating. A few guests leaned over and smiled as he passed. That smell." "Ah, the cook does it again." Josiah said nothing. In the dining room, candles flickered in golden holders. The colonel stood at the head of the table, one hand on his chest, the other around a wine glass. "Tonight," he said loudly, "we eat like kings, because that is what we are, masters of land, of wealth, and of fate." He sat. Josiah stepped forward. He placed the steaming bowl of venison stew directly before the colonel with quiet, deliberate care. Then he bowed his head, and the fire in his chest didn't flicker, it roared. Crystal glasses clinked like soft bells beneath the chandelier's golden glow. The long table, dressed in white linen and silverware polished until it gleamed, bore dishes so heavy with roasted meats, buttered vegetables, and sugar-glazed fruits that the legs of the table creaked in protest. Laughter bloomed like trumpet vines along the walls. A string quartet in the corner played something light and southern. The colonel sat at the head of the table, ruddy-faced and brimming with bourbon, basking in the glow of admiration. "This," he said, gesturing around the table with his glass, "this is what civilization looks like, gentlemen. Order, labor, refinement." He dipped his spoon into the steaming bowl of venison stew and brought it to his lips. The flavor, rich and spiced, hit him instantly, bold, deep, with a warmth that danced across the tongue. "God Almighty," he said, licking his lower lip like a man tasting victory. "No man dines better in all of Natchez than I." The guests chuckled, clapping their hands lightly on the table. One leaned toward the colonel. "You'll have to let your Josiah teach my kitchen girl a trick or two." The colonel laughed. "You can try, but you'll be sore disappointed. He's got salt in his bones, that one." Across the room, Josiah stood silently near the swinging kitchen door, a tray of buttered rolls in his hands. His face held the same mask it always did, quiet, blank, obedient. Only his eyes moved, tracing each spoonful the colonel brought to his mouth. 1, 2, 3. The colonel went on, talking with his mouth full, waving his spoon like a baton. "You know what separates a man from the beasts?" He asked the table. "It ain't money, it ain't books, it's the power to command and to be obeyed without question." More laughter, more glasses raised. A toast was made to cotton and conquest. 4 spoonfuls. 5, and then a pause. The colonel's eyes twitched, his brow furrowed. He blinked rapidly and brought a hand to his collar. "Is it hot in here?" he mumbled, voice cracking like dry wood. A few guests looked up from their plates. The candles flickered in the sudden hush between violin notes. The colonel reached for his water, sloshed it, missed the glass. His hand trembled. Then came the coughing. Low at first, then sharp, like bark from a broken dog. He clutched his throat, his spoon falling from his hand with a clang against the ceramic bowl. "Ambrose," someone said, concerned. The colonel gasped. His face had gone pale, then red, then something in between. Sweat sprang along his brow. His body lurched forward and a guttural noise escaped his throat. "Get him a doctor," someone shouted. "Water." "A cold cloth." Panic spread like spilled wine. The string quartet stopped mid-note. Chairs scraped back. A woman shrieked. Josiah moved with purpose, placing the tray of rolls gently on a sideboard, then stepping back into shadow. His breath came slow and deep. He watched, not with satisfaction, but with focus, with remembrance. The colonel's hands scrabbled at his neck as though trying to pull something out from beneath his skin. His lips turned blue. His voice, once the loudest in the room, became a series of choked whispers. He tried to rise but fell forward, knocking over a decanter of port. The red liquid bled across the white tablecloth, spreading toward the stew bowl. He collapsed. Screams erupted. Guests fled the room in every direction. Chairs toppled. Glass shattered. A housemaid dropped a silver serving dish and began to pray aloud in frantic sobs. An overseer tried to turn the colonel's limp body over but recoiled at the sight of foam collecting at the corners of his mouth. "Poison!" someone finally cried. "He's been poisoned." Footsteps thundered down the hall. Servants rushed in. The house doctor, fetched from his meal in the adjoining room, tried to administer salts. Nothing worked. Josiah stood still as the world spun. No one looked at him. No one dared. In the chaos, his face was just another shadow. He watched the colonel's final moments with the steady gaze of a man who had already buried his wife, already laid his child into the cold ground with bare hands. This was not triumph. This was justice. The man who had once dined like a king now choked on his own feast. A man who had fed off the backs of others died, tasting what it meant to lose control, even over his own breath. Silence fell as the last breath rattled free. Colonel Ambrose Dandridge lay sprawled across the length of his banquet table, mouth open, eyes wide, surrounded by spilled wine, broken silver, and half-eaten pride. The candles flickered, casting long shadows across his lifeless body. Josiah turned and walked back toward the kitchen, his steps quiet, his hands steady. By sunrise, the Dandridge estate was no longer a home of pride, but a house of suspicion. The parlor still stank of spilled wine and death. Flies gathered where stew had crusted along the edge of the colonel's untouched plate. The grand chandelier, once glittering above laughter and music, now hung above silence so heavy it pressed down on the shoulders of every soul inside. The colonel's body had been carted off before dawn, wrapped in white linen that soaked through with the last color left in him. In the quarters behind the fields, the enslaved were pulled from their bunks before morning prayers. "Who did it?" the overseers demanded, belts in hand and rifles slung low. "Who poisoned the colonel?" No one spoke, so they struck. Back, chest, cheek, wherever silence held. Old Lizzie's fingers were broken. Young Jeremiah was dragged behind the smokehouse and returned with blood in his hair. Ada, who swept the dining hall, was sold 2 days later without reason or warning. But the name on every overseer's tongue, the name on every warning shouted across the compound was the same, Josiah. The cook, gone, vanished before dawn like steam rising off a hot skillet. His bed was cold. His apron folded neatly across a stool. The small wooden box where he kept his spoons and seasonings sat empty on the shelf. They searched the woods, sent dogs toward the swamps east of Natchez, posted a bounty in town, wanted runaway Negro male. Tall, lean, scar on right forearm, may respond to Joe. No one claimed the reward. No one saw him again. But stories. Oh, the stories grew like moss in the shade. In the cabins, they whispered when the moon was high and the air was still. He left through the cane fields in the dead of night. He swam the river and joined a maroon camp down near Bayou Sarah. I heard he walked clean to freedom and opened a cafe in New Orleans where no white man dares eat. But the one that stuck, the one passed from lips to ears, from mother to child, from sorrow to hope, was this: the cook seasoned the master's last supper with death. And with that, Josiah became more than a man. He became a shadow on the wind, a prayer spoken over boiling pots, a promise that one day fire would answer fire, that no master dined without wondering what might be hidden beneath the rosemary and thyme. Among the white elites of Natchez, fear crept into the kitchens like smoke. They replaced cooks, sent their food to be tasted by servants first, installed locks on pantry doors. But no amount of control could quiet the uneasy question that now followed every forkful. What if this dish was touched by revenge? What if Josiah had taught others? In town, no one spoke of the colonel's death directly, but his absence was louder than any sermon. His plantation passed to a cousin who moved away within the year. The manor fell into disrepair. The banquet table was burned for firewood. In time, his name faded from ledgers, from invitations, from memory. But Josiah's name became gospel. A tale told in secret and in song. A story shared in the hush of a late-night meal, where collards simmered beside cornbread and eyes met with knowing glances. They said he was justice with a ladle. They said he stirred freedom into his stew. And somewhere, in the quiet corners of the South, it was said that every pot cooked with purpose might carry a piece of him still. Because Josiah didn't just feed the body. He fed the spirit of resistance. He fed the hunger for dignity. He fed the dream that no chain, no lash, no master's hand could stop a man who remembered who he was. And in every telling, the story ended the same way. Every bite he took was justice. And justice had the flavor of freedom.